example, and then I'll give you a time. Because the thing is, when you start getting into intestinal tracts, performing surgical procedures on that, actually removing ulcers and stuff like that is pretty not safe, good, etc. So they try to avoid that sort of thing. So they exhaust all the possibilities. And so what you're doing, it says right here, the patient swallows a deflated balloon with tubes attached.
Even that part is bad.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's still considered to be better than the alternative. Right? So, like, a simpler example is I had spinal surgery on my lower spine, but prior to that, they exhausted all other possibilities because generally they don't want to open up a person's back, right? So, prior to doing that, they gave epidural injections, right, with cortisone, right? Well, cortisone among other things. So. But it was done under anesthesia, but I found out that apparently not everybody gets it with anesthesia. Like you just lay on the table and you just take a needle straight into your spine, right? So that sounds pretty horrible in and of itself, but like I do it with sedation, so I'm generally out for a day when that happens, right? So late December or early January, I'll be missing a Thursday, right? Because that's every few months I have to go get an injection. Lower spine, I had my surgery already, but upper spine, I still need to have the injections in the hopes that I can avoid having the surgical procedure. All right, so, but it's a slippery slope. So, to avoid having a surgical procedure, people tend to want to try pretty much anything. And so, a refrigerated liquid gets pumped through this balloon for an hour. The idea is that cooling the stomach would reduce the production of acid and therefore relieve ulcers. Right, so it's not going to cure the ulcers; it's just going to relieve the pain. It's a Band-Aid, right? But the idea here is that if you can take the person out of pain, then what they can then do is attempt to try to remove the causal factors. All right, so whatever is aggravating the ulcer, perhaps like a diet change or some sort of lifestyle change, they can take it upon themselves to enact that. Because they're not in as much pain as they were before, all right? And so, like an ulcer, I have no idea what that feels like, but I'm told that it's excruciating. So, I always figured it was just some sort of like heartburn kind of thing. I've been told by some folks that it's like being stabbed repeatedly in the stomach. Right, so and other people have different experiences with it. So I can imagine that when the pain gets to be as excruciating as some people experience, you're willing to do pretty much anything. Right, and so what they did here was they had a design gastric freezing, observe pain relief. All right, so this experiment was poorly designed. The patient's response may have been due to the placebo effect. All right, so we know what the placebo effect is. Right, you respond favorably to a treatment, even something that is a placebo, right? So the thing is, the perception of a person does play a role into this whole thing, and so you have to account for that in some capacity. Now, I don't know, again, because I've never undergone this sort of thing, but I don't know to what extent a person would perceive gastric freezing. All right, are they going to feel something cold in their stomach when the process is happening? I would imagine that to some extent, maybe not. Are they doing it with sedation? Right, they swallow it and then you get knocked out for a little while, right? Or is robotics involved? Like, how do they navigate to the appropriate spot? Because obviously you're not swallowing it and hoping for the best, because if that happens, how do you know that the thing is going to get, the balloon is going to get to the right location, right? So is it laparoscopic, where they have the wires attached and they guide it to the appropriate location? All of that, I think, would be done with sedation. All right. I personally would hate to think that my spinal injections weren't really happening, that I was being sedated, knocked out, and I wake up and they just tell me I had an injection in my spine, and then hope for the best after that. I would like to think that they were actually doing what they were saying that they were doing. But if this is going to be a controlled experiment, we would need to know what the outcome would be for a person who only thinks that they had the treatment. All right. And so that in and of itself is kind of horrible to think about. A person kind of signs off on this. I mean, they definitely sign off on this. And the reality is that they're taking the chance that they're not going to actually get the treatment. All right? Because when you volunteer to be part of an experiment medically, you have to account for the fact when you sign off on it that you could be part of the control group. All right? So that goes for pretty much anything. All right? So, not to get too morbid here, but many years ago, my father, he had lung cancer, and he was a participant in an experiment. Right? They asked him if he wanted to try an experimental new drug, and part of the fine print in the document, and it was explained to him. It wasn't, he wasn't told, just read it, and they weren't hoping to get one by him, but they told him flat out, listen, it is possible that you could be in the control, all right? Which means that this experimental drug to cure your cancer may not be an experimental drug at all right? But that's the chance that you have to take, all right? So that is a possibility. I did not investigate further at the time to determine why they would need a placebo in that context, because I just don't understand that area of medical science well enough. But I would imagine that they were just doing what they're doing here, just trying to test to see if the mind over matter aspect of this would have any impact whatsoever. Because you definitely don't want to put a drug out to market and say, this is going to have an impact, this is going to shrink a tumor, for example, and then have it not do that. All right? So only because you didn't control, you didn't have a placebo involved. All right? So, that's an extreme example. This is, I use this because it's kind of attention grabbing, but it's not as morbid as some other situations. All right, so the big question here is, how should the design have been, how should the experiment have been designed? All right, so what I have to do here is go down the list and really talk about every item that could come into play. All right, so first off, we need experimental units. All right, now the experimental units, the EUs, would be subjects. All right, so these are human trials. All right. I would imagine, would have to have a common characteristic. They have ulcers, right? Yeah. All right. Now, intuitively, we could say ulcers that are severe enough that they would consider participating in this sort of thing, but I think this is good enough. All right. So, factors. Because any of these factors that, if not controlled, are going to lead to lurking variables and are going to mess up the whole thing. All right, because what they did was they just said, gastric freezing, pain relief. All right, I got a bunch of individuals in my sample. We're going to use this gastric freezing technique, and we're going to see how that impacts pain relief.
It's the size and shape of the stomach?
Size and shape of the stomach, all right, so physical characteristics, I'll say.
That would be a bit hard to control.
It would be hard to control, but at least if you go in knowing that. All right. With every statistical analysis, if you read it in a medical journal or engineering journal, you'll always see the fine print at the bottom that says, a small percentage of the population exhibited this characteristic and that characteristic and so on. So these are things that you have to take into account when you're evaluating whether these findings are appropriate for whatever you're using them for. All right. What else?
Severity of the ulcer.
Severity of the ulcer. All right, because pain relief is determined based off of the amount of initial pain. Right? So if a person had a level 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, and then it went down 2 units, right? So it became a level 8 afterwards. That's good. But if a person started off at a level 1 they can't possibly go down 2 units, right? They can't go to a level -1, right? So the severity would have an impact on this, right? So we might itemize our conclusions by saying, all right, for those who had the most severe ulcers, this is the average improvement, and for those who had mild ulcers, well, you'd be questioning why they were even participating in this, but you would say that this is what you could expect to see in terms of improvement level. All right, anything else?
This kind of goes along with medical history.
Medical history.
And obviously underneath that is like diet, other medications they're taking.
Diet, other meds. There's a lot of things that need to be accounted for here. Diet's a very important one, right? Because if they're going to have a burrito after this process, that might be an issue. Other medications, yeah, I don't know how much experience you have with that, but there are some medicines that you have to take with food, and there are some medicines that it doesn't matter. A lot of the times, the ones that you have to take with food, you have to take it with food because it'll tear up your stomach if you don't. All right. So medicines called NSAIDs, non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. Right. Those are your Aleve, Motrin, ibuprofen, any kind of ibuprofen, whether it's Advil or whatever. Those are generally coated pills. So the Advil, like if you've taken an Advil, it's coated, and if you've ever tasted the coating, it's sweet. All right, it's got a gel coating on it because that's designed to protect your stomach long enough for the medicine to pass through into the digestive process. All right, the problem is eventually that coating wears off, and whatever that medicine comes in contact with it's going to have an impact on. Right, so the idea is that it dissolves completely before it physically comes into contact with any of your insides, I guess. Right. So what they say is take it with food because the food acts as a natural barrier between the medicine and your stomach lining and also intestinal walls. Right. So basically, if you're participating in this study and you just had a handful of Aleve, that could be, well, first off, it could be a causal factor of why you're having problems to begin with, and also it could have a negative impact on the results. And you'll find if you were ever, you go into the medical field, I don't know how many of you are interested in that, but you'll find that overwhelming majority of the folks who have these kind of issues are ones that have been on those kind of medications for a long period of time, right? Because they have chronic pain and they try to manage it using those non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, and it takes a toll in different parts of their bodies. All right, so while we're here, we might as well throw in alcohol consumption. When you get older, your doctor's going to start asking you if you drink, and if so, how much, because that goes into your overall health, but also it factors in, like if you go in complaining of stomach pains, ulcer, any kind of ulcer-related things, that when they go to diagnose any problems that you might have, that's one of the first things they're going to ask you, all right? How much, if any, do you drink? And if you do, that's probably numero uno in terms of what to cut out, because that's along the same lines as those medications I was talking about, tears apart your insides. All right. Same thing with sodas. We did the rusty nail study in, it wasn't this class, it was a pre-calc class a bunch of years ago. Had the Coca-Cola. I told you about this? No. We had a jar of Coke, and we put a rusty nail in it. And what we did was we measured the weight over a period of a couple of months. And after a period of time, the size of the nail got smaller and smaller, obviously the mass. And one day I went in there looking for the nail, and I couldn't find it. And so either somebody played a prank on me, or, well, the data suggested that after a certain period of time, this is what should have happened anyway. there was no more nail. Right? That's because that's what the soda did to it. It dissolved it completely. So yeah, if it's going to do that to a nail, what do you think it's going to do to your insides? Right? So one day you'll start dripping soda out. That'd be terrible. So let's not drink soda. How about that? So anyway, I think we probably kind of nailed all the factors. Very nice. I don't even realize when I'm doing that. That's how hilarious I am. But anyway, the one that I suppose that we need to really make sure that we account for would be, how about the gastric freezing? All right, so I'm going to highlight that bad boy because that's the one we really care about. Because I'm looking to show a causal relationship. Because again, these are factors that could impact the response variable. All right, so all of these I want to try to keep under as much control as possible, but this is the one I want to vary. All right, so the explanatory variable comes from your list of factors, which is, I mean, you could say amount of gastric freezing. I mean, it's kind of awkward to think about it that way, but they said that they run this process for an hour, all right? So maybe you do it for half an hour. Maybe you do it for 45 minutes. Maybe you don't do it at all right? The response would be change in pain level. All right. We also need to indicate what type of data we're looking for here, because we could vary the amount of gastric freezing, and that could be whatever type of data, nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. But the change in pain level is really something that we need to be careful about, because it depends on how we define that. All right. So if we say pain before on a scale of 1 to 10, pain after on a scale of 1 to 10, find the difference. All right. And you would, of course, for the AP, define what 1 means and what 10 means. I'm not going to require that from you because I think it's obvious. All right. The way it's always been is 10 is always the worst of something, or the most of something, and 1 is the least of something, or the best. All right. So unless you think otherwise, in which case define. Ah.
You're like, rate your day 1 out of 10, and 10's the best.
Yeah.
Ah. But we're talking about pain here.
Yes, that's how I'm doing.
Oh, that's true. In
Yeah.
pain,
No,
10 is the worst.
10's like the best pain. It feels the best.
Yeah. I mean, philosophically, if you're like one of those
No
folks
pain, no gain.
that just loves pain, yeah.
That's
That'd
not
be-
gonna
That's
sound
not
good.
philosophically, that's like psychoanalytic.
That's just psychotic, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I hit you with a sledgehammer, that may be a 10, but like, whose scale are we looking at?
Yeah, that's true. Like the misery scale, Stephen
Also,
King.
how large is the sledgehammer? Where are you hitting me?
And whether or not there's a 2x4
Anywhere with a
separating your ankles.
sledgehammer
Am I
When
numb
it's-
at the time?
Of basic size and shape.
How strong is that?
Well, the
Yeah.
sledgehammer is supposed to be doing all the work.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
that's what it is. Yeah, so, okay, so revised statement. If there is any doubt as to the interpretation of scale of 1 to 10, then please indicate so. So I will be courteous here, as Mr. Cohen would say, and say 1 is least and 10 is most. All right. Now, what type of data would the difference in pain level be? Nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio? Well, we know it's not nominal, so I'm just in name only. You know, like a number would have no meaning. Well, a number has meaning. All right, so, and the order of values would have meaning.
We're only doing 1 through 10 here.
I would say either
Ratio.
Interval.
Interval or
Because there's no 0.
Difference.
Oh, I guess.
Yeah, because if the pain level didn't change, all right, so this is at the ratio level. That's because it's possible that there is no difference in pain. That would be it just not working.
Couldn't there also be a negative difference in pain if they went up somehow?
Yeah, conceptually. So that would be accounted for in the ratio level also, because the ordering values matter, so. Okay, so that gets us pretty much everything we need. So what we do now is we just draw a quick diagram for, I'm still working on the reason why, for the AP people, all right? I kind of always sell this as, well, why not draw a diagram, right? Because there's like simpletons out there that will look at this and say, okay, well, just spell it out for me, all right? Give me a diagram. I need a flow chart. I can't visualize what's going on here. So just kind of give me something, all right? The AP folks want a diagram, even though I think everything that we need has been accounted for here, all right? But we're going to spell it out in the form of a diagram. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say that we're going to have a simple random sample that breaks our individuals up into a control and experimental group, assuming my pen wants to work.
what's JRS?
That's supposed to be an S. SRS, simple random sample. Now, if I had my Freon and the tubes and the balloons, we would conduct this experiment here, but I don't, so I'm not going to bother breaking you up into control and experimental groups, so maybe some other day.
We also don't really have a collection of people with ulcers.
Yeah, we could just pretend that part. You know.
Ow.
So, the control group gets the placebo. So, no something. No
They would just get a balloon.
coolant.
They would just swallow an empty.
Swallowing an empty balloon.
That's awful.
All right. The experimental group gets the balloon. Balloon. That just took off on me. With coolant. Yeah, that's why the Freon is the first thing that came to my mind. It's like they don't use Freon, I don't think, but it's some kind of refrigerant. Could just be cold water that they pump through. Yeah, so yeah, because back in the day when I was in college well, the way NYU worked is that there was certain dorms that were air conditioned and certain ones that were not. And so if you were taking summer classes for only a couple of weeks, you could pay $50 a week as long as you could deal with the non-air conditioned apartments, or you could pay $350 a week and have an air conditioned apartment. So I opted for the $50 a week. After the first week, I was dying. So my father, who was an engineer, taught me a little something. And so I actually came in with a radiator, a car radiator, hooked it up to the faucet with a hose, pumped cold water through it, just like regular cold water from the faucet, and then put a fan behind it. And that cooled the room.
No way.
Yeah, because honestly, all you need is like a 20-degree change in temperature, and that's what it did. And so it was like a MacGyver-style air conditioner
I'm gonna use a
created.
lot of water though.
Yeah, but I wasn't paying for that stuff. Sure, yeah.
I really wish I knew that now. Because I spent 3 weeks back between like 6th and 7th grade, living in a dorm room, and there was absolutely no air conditioning. It was 100 degrees the first week. And there were other problems.
Yeah. My son was participating in the Army hockey camp over the summer, and it was the same deal. But he had the opportunity to dorm, or we commuted, and he was so happy that we commuted because he's like, the kids would come in the morning, they were dripping with sweat. They're like, it was 100 degrees last night. He's like, well, thank God I slept in air conditioning. So, change in pain. Change in pain. And then we compare. Now, quick question. Would you like the folks who are receiving a placebo to know that they're getting a placebo?
No.
No.
Blind them.
So let's blind them. Put blindfolds on them. Blind study. You can see why there's so many typos, right? I just rush and I just write stuff. It's a blind study. Does it need to be double blind? Not necessarily, because the researcher, I don't think, is going to look at a person and say, oh, yeah, you look like you're not in pain anymore. That ulcer looks like it is not painful. Okay? It's going to go by the perception of the individual.
You can't really see inside of the person.
Right. So, I mean, they could put a camera on there while they're in there. In fact, they will have a camera on there while they're in there, because that is part of the fun, I guess. That's what they do with endoscopies. They and they do this without sedation also, I found out. But I had mine with sedation. So they just put a tube down your throat while you're asleep, and then they slide a camera down there on the end of a wire harness, and then they navigate it around using robotics, and that camera takes images of the inside of your stomach and upper intestines. Right? So they're doing that along with the gastric freezing technique. So, it sounds probably a lot more horrible than it is, but it's I don't want to say it's a perfected medical science, but it's better than, like you're probably imagining, something in the 50s or 60s where they're like open wide and then they shove it in your throat. Like, it's not like that, right? So
Is that what they did in the 50s and 60s?
I don't know. That's what I imagine the 50s and 60s were like. So it's like, because every time I heard a story about my parents going to the dentist, it's always like, here's a shot of whiskey, now open wide, I'm going to drill your teeth, So, like, I don't know if they were doing that for scare tactics or that's how the dental industry worked, but it was frightening. So I'm glad I didn't grow up in that era.
I think you just gave it to him out of